guys, so today we're going to be going over Unit 1, Lesson number 5. This is actually your last lesson for your Unit 1. So after this, we will be reviewing and practicing our FRQs before our Unit 1 test next week. So today we're going to cover food webs and energy flow. It should go pretty quick because you guys have probably learned about food webs in elementary school and middle school. So really it's just going to be the energy calculations that are going to be kind of new to you here today. So let's just define a few things before we move forward. So energy captured by producers moves through many trophic levels. Okay, and to know those trophic levels, let's make some definitions here. Okay, so define some things. So a consumer is an organism that is incapable of photosynthesis and must obtain its energy by consuming other organisms, also known as a heterotroph. We are consumers, we are heterotrophs. We cannot absorb sunlight and make our own food. We gotta eat it elsewhere, so we are consumers. An herbivore is a consumer that only eats producers. These are also known as primary consumers. So primary consumers are the ones that eat the plants. A carnivore is a consumer that eats other consumers exclusively. So carnivores only eat other animals. If you're an omnivore, you eat plants and animals. If you're a human and you are a vegetarian or a vegan, you are strictly an herbivore. A secondary consumer is a carnivore that eats primary consumers. So they eat the things that eat the plants. A tertiary consumer is a carnivore that eats secondary consumers, so they eat the things that eat the plants. And then trophic levels are the successive levels of organisms consuming one another. And then the food chain is just a sequence of consumption from producers through all the way up to the tertiary consumers. You can also see a tertiary consumer defined as a top consumer, so just know that those two are interchangeable. So here we have a simple food chain. A lot of food chains and food webs that we look at will be very simplistic. In the world and in the real world, they're actually a lot more complicated, but this is just for, educational purposes. And so we do have to simplify things a little bit to look at them. Okay. So at the bottom, we've got our producers. Those are the organisms that can capture sunlight and make their own food. And then we've got our primary consumers, which are the things that eat the producers. Then we have our secondary consumers, which will eat the primary consumers. And then we've got our tertiary consumers that will then eat the secondary consumers. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we've got our grasses as our producers. And then our zebra eats our grasses, so they're the primary consumer. And then our lion is technically our secondary consumer, but he's also at the top of our food chain, and he will eat the zebra. And then on our other food chain, we've got algae, which is the producer, which is eaten by the zooplankton. The zooplankton is eaten by the fish, which is the secondary consumer. And then the bald eagle will scoop the fish out of the water and eat it. So that is our top or our tertiary consumer. A food web is a complex model of how energy and matter move between the trophic levels. A scavenger is an organism that consumes dead animals. So think of like buzzards, the birds that will eat roadkill. Those are scavengers. A detritivore is an organism that specializes in breaking down dead tissues and waste products into smaller particles. And then decomposers are fungi and bacteria that convert organic matter into small elements and molecules that can be recycled back into the ecosystem. So remember, decomposers play a really big part in the nitrogen cycle. So here is another simplified food web. It's color-coded for you to tell you kind of what each organism is. So the yellow is the primary consumer, the green is the producer. We can see the acacia tree there is green. Our giraffes, our zebras, our primary consumers, so our gazelles. The blue is going to be our secondary consumers, and then we also have scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers as well. Now we have to talk about something that's a little more complicated, which is ecosystem efficiency. And when we talk about the efficiency of ecosystems, we're talking about the movement of the energy throughout the ecosystem. So in our last lesson, when we did our gross primary productivity, we learned that most of the energy in an ecosystem is actually with the producers because they're the ones making the energy, right? They're the ones that are capturing the sunlight and they make the energy. So they're at the bottom of the pyramid, okay? So they're always going to be at the bottom of our energy pyramid because they have the most energy. But we have to understand that a lot of this energy, so most of this energy, does not make it up the food chain. Okay, so this is the gross primary productivity of our producers, but it doesn't all go to the primary and secondary consumers. Some of it gets lost. Okay, so a lot of it actually gets lost as heat. So when we look at a energy pyramid, the producers will always be at the bottom with the most energy available, and our top consumers will be at the top with the least energy available. Okay, and we have to follow something called the 10% rule. So the 10% rule is that we assume that only 10% of energy is transferred up the food chain. This means that 90% of that energy is lost, and it's lost in the form of heat. So the reason that we don't have more consumers, so if we think about ecosystems, there's a lot of grasses, there's a lot of trees. If you think about one single blade of grass or a plant that's doing photosynthesis, they cover entire ecosystems. There's billions of them. But then if we think about top consumers, so lions, bald eagles, a lot of those animals are endangered, and they don't travel, or they don't have very many in their populations. And the reason for that is they are limited by the energy available at the top of the pyramid. So they eat, other consumers that are then eating on a lower trophic level. And there's just not as much energy available at the top of the pyramid to support those super large animals. So if we look back and we follow this 10% rule, so we've got 10,000 joules available in our producers on the bottom of this pyramid. Okay, only 10% is going to move up to the primary producers or the primary consumers. So that zebra, I almost said giraffe, that is not a giraffe, it is a zebra. So the zebras that are eating the producers are only going to get 10% of that energy. Okay, so 1,000 joules, 10% of 10,000, so 10,000 times 0.1, which is 10%, is going to give us 1,000. So there are now 1,000 joules of energy available to those zebras. Okay, so then when we look at the energy that goes to the top consumers, another 90% will be lost, so only 10% will be transferred up. So we go from 1,000 joules to 100 joules at the top. So there's less energy available just to support those very large top consumers. So that's why we see less of them and we see more producers on the bottom. And then just to reiterate, most of the energy in food webs are lost as heat. So we lose the energy as heat. Okay, and then the last few slides here are just examples of food webs, and you can kind of follow the arrows just like in our biogeochemical cycles to see where everybody goes, and you can kind of tell who is a producer, who's a consumer, and then we do need to be able to identify the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers because we will have a practice FRQ where we look at that. Here's a desert food web, and again, these are just examples, and we can take the time, or you guys can go back and take the time to look at these if you want to. And then here would be an example in a marine food web, and here is a rainforest food web. Your rainforests are incredibly biodiverse, and like I said, all of these are very simplistic. So this is a very simplified form of your food chains and your food webs. In real ecosystems, it's a lot more complex, but for learning purposes and for the basis of this knowledge, this works for us just fine.